The whole town is in shock and quiet, with their mouths hanging open in amazement as if this catastrophe happened out of nowhere. You're sitting back with that calm, knowing expression on your face, the same look you had months ago when you knew this was going to happen. They said you were paranoid, overly intense, and over the top. A person who thinks too much about things. But now they have to confront the harsh reality that they can't accept. You weren't forecasting the future. You were just waking. The only one who dared to observe the indications as they played pretend with their eyes wide open and thoughts locked closed. Your talent has always been that you can see things in life that most people can't even see when they are having fun with superficial performances. You were in touch with what wasn't spoken. You paid attention to what wasn't being said because you could feel the change in energy, the tension in the quiet, and the inconsistency behind every word. To the pauses that were louder than the talks, and the little but important shifts in conduct. People were deceived by charisma, loudness, and confidence. You could see the fractures in the mask. You know when something doesn't fit because you've been through a lot, lost a lot, and been lied to a lot. This isn't paranoia, no matter how polished it seems. It's just perfected pattern recognition. And while you may not have noticed it at the time, 3 unique truths were rising inside you, aligning in ways that would finally erupt into clarity. First, you realized that your sensitivity, which you used to think was a defect, was really a highly calibrated radar. Second was social. It was clear that what seemed like community was sometimes merely a well-rehearsed show. And finally, the most devastating was systemic. Understanding that everything constructed on denial and delusion doesn't simply become weaker over time. It falls apart totally. You understood the reality that many still don't. Stability and momentum are not the same thing. They were busy applauding for show, while you were silently analyzing the construction. While they were happy at the message, you looked into the reason. And even if they were lost in the volume, you were still grounded enough to detect the cracks in the noise. When you spoke out, everything changed. Not because you were incorrect, but because you were right before they were ready. And when reality comes too soon, people don't simply ignore it. They attempt to break it. You became the issue just by being honest. The reaction came in waves. People making fun of you behind your back. Sarcasm right in front of you. Jokes that weren't truly jokes. You spoke out because you were worried, but they saw your voice as a threat. But deep inside, they felt the same way you did. They simply weren't ready to deal with it. They made you the scapegoat instead of dealing with the unpleasantness. This part of your awakening showed you how lonely it may be to see too much too fast. You were already standing in future, while others were still relishing yesterday's illusion. It was tiring to explain storm clouds to folks who were hooked to sunlight and warn people who were fascinated with new paint about fractures in the foundation. It's always simpler for them to make fun of the messenger than to embrace the message. It's easier to laugh than to pay attention. It's easier to call you too emotional than to say you could be correct. And so they clung to their delusions, frantically believing your voice was only noise. If you were correct, everything they believed in would start to fall apart. But you were never pursuing attention, and you definitely weren't attempting to be a prophet. You just wouldn't let yourself be blind in a society where everyone else regarded denial like a holy right. The difficult thing wasn't that you were correct. It was something you never wanted to be. You didn't want things to be chaotic or for anybody to fail. You spoke out because your gut told you to. Your soul couldn't lie to itself, as others appeared to do so easily, while they clung to the soothing stories they wanted to believe. You took the hard decision to accept what was really happening in front of you. And that type of clarity, it costs a lot of money. It costs comfort. It costs friendships. At times, it costs you your own tranquility. Because once you've seen the truth, once the curtain is removed, there's no way to return to ignorance. You can't unsee how individuals manipulate, fake loyalty, and read scripts to keep themselves and others sleeping. And when you attempted to tell them what you saw, they didn't thank you. You were called the pessimist, the one who ruined the moment by telling the truth. A big change was happening deep within you at this time. Your inner compass was slowly resetting itself, learning how to tell the difference between true connection and fake bonding. It wasn't a talent you wanted to learn. It was a natural impulse to stay alive, born from too many interactions with masks and emotional mirages. You weren't intending to hurt anybody or anything. You were attempting to stop a collapse that only you could see so clearly that it hurt. You were the lighthouse amid the storm, attempting to keep ships from running into trouble. But they thought your beam was a danger to their path. You were called the issue, the troublemaker, and the threat. In reality, you were the warning flare, attempting to safeguard what was important. They dubbed you the fire, not knowing that you were attempting to stop one from destroying all they cared about. As time went on, you started to feel something they couldn't yet identify. A creeping, unseen rot set in long before any apparent disintegration. The color disappeared, and something fake took its place. What previously seemed real now felt like a rehearsal. Real exhilaration faded into nothing. Smile as the compliment that was too tight lost its warmth. The room, which had previously been full of energy, now seemed heavy and far away, as if the air itself knew something was dying. But no one wanted to say it. They were continuing putting together idyllic moments as the reality slowly faded away. And you were already sad, even if others were still holding on to false hopes. Sad about how things used to be. You had observed the fire in their eyes, dull into acting. You were sad that realness was gone while they were still cheering for the spectacle. And when the crash eventually happened, you didn't flinch. You weren't shocked or angry. You had already been carrying the emotional weight of this ending in silence long before they were ready to recognize that anything was wrong. This is when your second change started. Not in revolt, but in retreat. You stopped talking not because you had nothing more to say, but because you finally realized that your truth was not safe with them. People took what you said and twisted it, repackaged it, and used it against you every time you attempted to be honest. They weren't listening to learn. They were listening to detect guns. So you accepted strategic quiet, not out of fear, but from hard-gained insight. You learned that sometimes preserving your truth means keeping it safe. Keeping it near instead than giving it to those who only want to break it down, change it, or destroy it. People thought your quiet meant you were giving up, but it was louder than any debate. It was the moment you stopped wanting to be understood and started getting ready for the storm you knew was coming. People noticed when you stopped talking. They felt you'd ran out of things to say, that you'd lost your edge. But they didn't know that being quiet was a sign of strength. Your means of taking back control in a world where your words were used against you. And even if they still didn't get you, something else started to make sense to you. You were never supposed to persuade. It was to remain grounded as the world around you fell apart, and you learned from your mistakes. This wasn't about making a statement. It was about being spiritually and emotionally prepared. Everyone who ignored your warnings was unintentionally letting themselves off the hook for the future you were silently building. You were making something deep even while you were silent. They held on to their false beliefs and put on a show of togetherness for the audience. You were looking for others like you, souls who had also seen beneath the mask. You discovered your tribe, not a community that agreed on everything, but one that was unified by a commitment to truth over convenience and clarity over conformity. These weren't the people who cheered from the sidelines when it was cool to do so. These were fighters, people who would stand up for you even if it meant putting anything on the line. You learned to discern the ones who desired genuine change from the ones who simply wanted a front row ticket to the drama. As long as it didn't cost them their name, presence, or sacrifice, the onlookers adored the show of defiance. But the warriors stepped up when it counted the most. They didn't back down as the pressure became worse. They recognized that professional builders don't need others to watch them work. They need additional builders and dreamers who are prepared to get their hands dirty to make something true. At this point in your awakening, you saw something that hurt much more than the teasing or the rejection. You saw devotion turn into power. What originally appeared like togetherness and common purpose started to expose itself as deliberate strategy. People weren't sticking by one another because they believed in something greater. They were making deals with each other because it seemed safe, lucrative, or politically smart. And as the winds changed, so did their loyalty. Not because of development or revelation, but just because it was in their own best interest. They termed it evolution, but your soul knew what it was. The most hidden type of opportunism. You could sense it in the little changes, like how they spoke and retained half-truths, and how they stayed just far enough away to avoid accountability if things went wrong. But if you had said anything, you would have seemed resentful or crazy. So instead, you watched in quiet as individuals showed their actual affiliations. Not when things were easy, but when it would cost them something to be strong. At that point, you knew that certain individuals would never be honest, committed to their objective, or loyal to you. They were solely devoted to their own pleasure. And when that comfort was compromised, so did their character. This awareness clashed with something far deeper and more troubling. The community you used to trust and the group you thought you were secure and started to reveal its real colors. What seemed like a real relationship suddenly seemed like a complicated play. There were scripts behind the grins, costumes behind the characters, and practiced applause behind every so-called breakthrough. The more you looked, the more layers you found. There were concealed power structures masquerading as equality. Hidden contests that seemed like cooperation and sneaky manipulations that looked like help. People weren't connecting on a spiritual level. They were networking from one profile to another, as brands do at a trade show. Every meeting began to seem like a bazaar where the only thing everybody was really selling was a better version of themselves. And in that place, being real didn't simply go away. It was sent away. You began to notice the patterns with clear clarity, how discussions started seeming scripted, how certain sentences were repeated like chants to preserve the image of oneness. Words that used to imply something precious, like progress, community, and authenticity, have been emptied out and turned into weapons. They had turned into nothing more than marketing phrases used to sell a way of life instead of being true. When individuals spoke about change, they actually meant making their social media profiles seem better. When they spoke of healing, they didn't mean depth or completeness. It was about turning their agony into a profit. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the empty words. It was how disagreement had become a disease. People didn't only think it was inappropriate to doubt the story. People thought it was nasty, bad, and out of line. No one disagreed with disagreement. They figured it out. Those who ventured to think critically or look for subtleties were called resistant to growth. You observed in silence as smart people trained themselves to stop using their own judgment because they were frightened that too much depth would drive them away from the only community they felt they had. And that's when the most painful reality struck you. What you thought was a community was really a well-arranged costume party. At first, it seemed like a goal, like coming together. In actuality, like a tribe marching together. But the more you remained, the more the curtain opened. The support seemed forced. Comments were presented with practiced passion, but only while others were looking. Praise turned into performance. People started to use applause as money. What had been shown as a genuine group was actually an audition room where everyone played a part to keep the illusion going. You began to realize that love wasn't always there for you. It was a deal. People weren't respected for their heart or integrity, but for their reach, their clout, their usefulness. Trust wasn't the basis of relationships. Exposure was. Vulnerability was replaced with visibility. Convenience came before connection. And if you didn't follow the rules, like not wearing the costume and reading from their script, they would discreetly remove you. Not because you were incorrect, but because your genuineness disturbed the illusion. This home that once seemed like family showed itself to be a marketplace. Loyalty has a price. There were conditions on the praise. And as soon as you stopped feeding the picture, you were gone. Not because you lost your worth, but because you no longer fit the story. They were making money. That hurt the most. Not only the loss, but the treachery. Because you had really come. You had cared. You had faith in the mission. You had put your heart and soul into something you felt was holy. But your honesty had become raw material for a machine that polished honesty and content that turned your reality into a well-curated brand. Your weakness made them seem credible. They took your ideas and put them together to make them seem like their own. Your growth, your hard-won transformation was commodified into their success tale. You weren't part of a group. You were resource thought and repurposing. This enlightenment brought with it a loneliness that went deeper than merely being alone. It was the type of loneliness that comes from being among people who don't know what true connection is like. They sacrificed being real for being praised and being deep for being validated. Soul for a plan. And once you saw that conversation clearly, you couldn't unsee it. You already knew the game was unfair. But this was different. This wasn't simply about a system that wasn't working. It was about the sorrow of learning that what you thought was love, what you thought was togetherness, was really acting. A little break. Family. If this message speaks to your heart and you want to help with this vital task, you may buy me a coffee. It helps maintain this place flowing with truth, light, and divine clarity. If you want to join me on this voyage, leave a comment with the number 88. The link is in the description. As we kept going around this time, another pattern started to become clear. When you couldn't ignore anymore. People who had put themselves in charge weren't really in charge at all. They were getting energy, attention, and trust from people who really wanted to change. Their choices weren't guided by purpose or vision. They were meticulously planned to keep them in the limelight and at the focus of attention and influence. Every emotional speech, every lofty vision, and every so-called call to action was more about protecting their own ego than about helping others. You watch how they made sure they were always with individuals who wouldn't question them and how they made sure that disagreement wasn't welcome. A single inquiry was enough to have someone thrown out. Not because the question was inaccurate, but because it put the illusion in danger. They were putting in so much effort to keep it up. People thought they were seeing leadership, but it was really performance art. And what seemed like wisdom was just a screenplay. Recycled platitudes, catchy slogans, and empty promises used to get attention without really saying anything. They had learned how to make things seem deeper. The words they said danced wonderfully in the air, but they didn't go anywhere useful. They spoke about change, but they never let anything really change, since genuine change would mean giving up the pedestal that their identity relied on. You started to realize that the underlying goal was to make crises happen, so they would stay important. They created issues, so they could be seen as the hero by changing the stories. So they always seemed to be the answer to the mess. They planned things in a quiet way. It was a cycle of drama and salvation that kept followers emotionally hooked, spiritually confused, and always needing help via shared anger, fake urgency, and emotional instability. They fabricated closeness. They used tragedy to connect with their followers, making them feel close by bringing up old scars and acting like they were the only ones who could understand or cure them. But the most evil thing you saw was how they used honesty as a weapon. They took advantage of the real wants of seekers, who were individuals who really wanted to develop and learn more about themselves. They turned that holy yearning into spiritual consumerism. Enlightenment turned into a commodity. People paid a lot of money for healing. Wisdom that comes in bundles and subscriptions, but not live material. Their whole platform was a financial plan that looked like a spiritual purpose. But what really scared you is how they cut individuals off from their own inner knowledge. With love bombing on one hand and gaslighting on the other. They taught individuals to doubt their gut feelings so they could get the leader's favor. What appeared like empowerment was hidden dependence. What sounded like freedom was really restricted in a costume. You outgrown their story, and you did it unashamedly. They had put you in a position that made them feel at ease. One where you remained acceptable, predictable, little, a character that didn't challenge the storyline, didn't question the motivations, didn't interrupt the flow of adulation they had generated. But genuine progress never waits for permission. And when your growth no longer matched the role they had written for you, your very existence was a problem. Your growth disturbed the very core of their tale. Not because you were incorrect, but because you stopped trying to fit into their story. They thought your development was a revolt, not because you were going against it, but because it made it harder for them to manage the story. The instant you stop making yourself smaller to make them feel better, they lose control of the tale. You weren't aiming to take over their power. You were just becoming the person you were always supposed to be. But for others who had put their heart and soul into your lesser form, your real growth seemed like a betrayal. They didn't perceive your recovery as attractive. They thought it was disobeying. Audience, but freedom brought a new sort of problem. One that wasn't outward, but inward. When you left the stage, you were no longer in the familiar roles, scripts, and applause. Instead, you were in a huge, unknown desert. The persona that had been created to make people happy was no longer useful. And without it, you had to find your own truth again without the continuous support and the people who used to define you. You have to ask yourself the most important question. Who am I under all this conditioning? This section of the voyage carried with it an odd, holy mix of sadness and happiness. You mourned the feeling of belonging, even though you knew that it had only been there because you had agreed to it. You regretted the friendships that broke apart in the light of your progress. Relationships that, looking back, never accepted who you really are. You were sad about the dreams you had constructed on the weak base of lies. But there was a sweet and constant flow of calm running through that sadness. You weren't performing for the first time in what seemed like a lifetime. You weren't hiding the truth or giving up your authority to make other people feel better. You weren't walking on eggshells when it came to your feelings and trying to control how everyone else reacted simply to fit in. You were just living without filters, without shame, and free. In that raw simplicity, you found a greater truth. The whole time she was going through lies and disappointment, it was never punishment. It was getting ready. Every falsehood you found helped you learn how to see the truth clearly. Every time you withstood manipulation, your limits became stronger. Every mask you saw made you remember how important it is to be real. The pandemonium had made things clearer. The betrayal had made it easier to distinguish right from wrong. And now, as you stand at this great point of confluence, everything that previously looked broken suddenly comes together. The personal, the social, and the structural. All of those strands of consciousness come together to form one reality that can't be denied. Being sensitive wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't too much thought. It was your shield. It got you ready. You can now tell that the act you saw wasn't only for one group or community. It was an operating system for the whole world. A default mode of being in a world where people are afraid of the truth. It was never a coincidence that you sensed the collapse coming. It was integrated into the fundamental framework of what had been constructed. Now that everything around you is starting to collapse, you aren't panicking, just as you always knew you wouldn't. You don't want to know why. You've been quietly and dutifully keeping the truth all along. You didn't merely see the end coming. You knew that the foundation it was constructed on was weak, but other people were drawn in by the glitz, the speed, and the commotion. You were paying attention to the quiet that was below it all. You were looking at the scaffolding and saw that several of the support beams were missing and the structures were weak. You knew the truth. Anything that is founded on avoidance will fall apart with time. This isn't a shock. It's what everyone decided to do. A civilization that put image over integrity chose illusion and quiet over truth. Those very questions may have salvaged it. And now that the dust is starting to settle and the mask is finally coming off, you are still standing firm, not in astonishment, but in assurance. Because you always knew. You always saw. You noticed in the gaps. They attempted to hide it in every forced grin that didn't quite reach the eyes and every opportune quiet that took the place of real discussion. You could see that individuals were using words like stay positive to shut out actual worries, as if the reality was somehow endangering the image they were holding on to. You weren't being rude. You were in trouble. You weren't letting fear get the best of you. You were grounded in reality. You got it. Most people didn't want to believe that motion without a base inevitably falls to gravity. That kind of pace without a plan is a recipe for catastrophe. The more they applauded for things that weren't real, the louder the quiet below became. You didn't want things to end badly, but you sensed it coming. You saw the signs of the building falling apart long before the walls started to quake. Not because you were showing it, but because the plan was wrong from the start, and your soul could read it like a map. You didn't need to close. Closure means Hamilton's really mull at FaceX, exclamation point, SPA, Jameen's, HS, and clip. But you know that closure is frequently just a hidden tie. Another approach to keep you interested in a narrative that has already ended is to make you think you were waiting at doors for apologies or long overdue explanations. You didn't want to be validated by those who had already changed the past to make themselves feel better about their guilt. What you really wanted in the quiet parts of your heart was proof that you weren't making things up, that you weren't being too suspicious or overly sensitive. You only needed to know that your gut was right. Your impression was correct, and your emotional radar hadn't deceived you. And you were free as soon as you stopped asking other people to affirm what your spirit already understood. At that point, you knew that truth doesn't always come in the form of talks. It sometimes shows itself quietly, via patterns, through absence, or through the slow death of lies. You quit trying to get clear answers from those who are busy manufacturing fresh lies. You stopped expecting individuals who were used to lying to be honest. You started to trust instead. You didn't have to push the truth to come out. You just had to remain in line with it until it did. You didn't need somebody to come back and confess anymore. You only had to sit still long enough to see what happens after the masks come off and the show is over. And now that time has arrived, and you didn't have to do anything, say anything, or attempt to prove anything. The truth is coming out in plain sight. People are dissolving in the very manner you previously mumbled to yourself late at night. As the lights go off and the audience leaves, the facade are crumbling. The personalities are disintegrating, and the well-written stories are tumbling apart. The genuine selves come out, each one free of censorship, protection, and doubt. And those unvarnished truths are what you need to hear to know that you're right. This confirmation is more than simply proof. It's the start of something. It comes with a subtle sense of duty that you're just starting to understand. Because now that you've recognized the illusion for what it is, now that you've gone through the wilderness of waking and come out on the other side with your soul and integrity fully intact, You hold something unique, something holy. You have the power to assist other people deal with their own problems. You don't have to be a typical leader. You know how bad performative leadership can be. You've seen as championships were utilized to dominate rather than uplift. This trip doesn't want you to be better than other people. It's asking you to walk with them as a live example of what can happen when someone chooses truth over comfort, development over acceptance, and sincerity over acclaim. You're not here to preach. You're here to hold space and be the gentle light that says, yes, I've been there. Yes, it's scary. Yes, it's worth it. The message is your life lived in accordance. Your example becomes the path. And in a society that still cares a lot about how things seem, your presence, which is based on truth, becomes revolutionary. Your entire presence is evidence that there is another way to live. A manner that doesn't mean giving up all to be accepted, turning down your light to feel better, or going along with false ideas. To be seen. What used to seem like an excruciating sensitivity, a burden that kept you from being with other people, has turned out to be a holy gift, a way to serve God. Your capacity to identify dishonesty isn't paranoia. It's not only for you. It's also for others who haven't learned to trust their gut yet. The emotional intensity that made you feel too much in shallow places is now a healing salve for people who believe their depth was a flaw in your bravery to stand alone, particularly when it would have been so much simpler to follow. The crowd has given other people the go-ahead to finally leave places that never respected who they really were. What you formerly questioned about yourself, your profound sensitivity, your constant awareness, your resistance to play along has all been proven as wisdom. The patterns you saw in silence are not only in human relationships, they're also in larger systems. The fissures you saw weren't just one. They were part of a world that was falling apart. Now that things are happening just as your soul expected, every part of your awakening has come together, showing you a bigger picture that you were always destined to witness. The wildness you traveled through wasn't merely for your own freedom. It was initiation. It was like working out your soul, so you could be there for those who might one day be where you were confused, deceived, and looking for what's genuine in a world of deception. You didn't choose to be a link between what is real and what is not. You lived through the change, and you didn't numb yourself to make it happen, because you wanted everything to be clear. When everyone else picked what was easy, and now the murmurs you used to keep to yourself. The instinctive warnings you once second-guessed are becoming the very words resounding in rooms that are finally ready to hear them. You were never after vengeance. You didn't need to be recognized. All you ever wanted was for truth to stand tall on its own, without having you to pull it, defend it, or explain it to those bent to misunderstanding you. You weren't angry. You were merely early. You didn't cause problems. You were clear. And you didn't outgrow people because of your ego. You became too big for the performance they made you take part in. Now you stand in the aftermath with respect, not with arrogance. You're not happy that you're correct. You're commemorating the bravery it needed to remain awake in a world that wants to send you to sleep. You're admitting that it required fortitude to choose development over acceptance and to leave behind comfortable falsehoods in favor of difficult facts. This isn't the conclusion of the narrative. This is the start of the genuine narrative that you were meant to live. Now you know what your job is. You were never supposed to rescue everyone. You were supposed to keep the hope of salvation alive. You don't have to repair every faulty system. You were told to make something better. You weren't chosen to be popular. You were picked to be genuine. In a society that loves masks and rewards those who aren't real, your sensitivity was never a bad thing. It was your special ability, your profound vision, your profound feelings, and deep knowledge. These are the things that kept you connected to the truth while the world attempted to draw you into a lie. You never had to deal with this. It was something holy to revere and something wonderful to own. A calling that is part of who you are. Yes, people in the community are in disbelief right now. But you're not shocked since you were meant to see what others couldn't. You were supposed to see the indications that other people missed. Not as a punishment, but as a way to be ready. Not as a prophesy, but as a way to keep safe. In a world that frequently waits too long, you are the early warning system. You don't want to, but your presence breaks down illusions and brings about enlightenment. That's just who you are. Now, chosen one, go ahead not in fear, but with the knowledge that the world needs your distinct vibration, your groundedness, your unwavering clarity, and your wild truth. They need someone who can see things as they really are, not through rose-colored glasses. You were never broken by this incident. You were broken open so that more light could come in and more knowledge could come out. So you may finally become the person you were destined to be. The conclusion you saw wasn't the end of you. It was the holy place for a fresh start. What happens next? It needs you. It needs individuals like you. People who can see through lies, the heart to care, through agony, and the power to make something genuine, raw, and permanent. People are starting to understand you better. You are entering a time when you are very important. The things that used to make you an outcast now make you a pioneer. Step into this job not with reluctance, but with confidence, because every betrayal, every waking, every lonely night, and every silent truth made you who you are right now. The truth doesn't require anyone's permission to come. It just requires one courageous person to notice it, and another to repeat it, and another to live it out loud. You have always been that fearless person. It still is, and it will always be. That's all for now. Dear Dad, I pray for the development of my faith. Even when there isn't any tangible proof, help me believe you. Let me believe that you will always be there for me and that you will never hurt me. I realize that your thoughts for me are ideas of success and not harm to offer me a nice future. Thank you, kind and everlasting Father, for always hearing what I have to say. I offer up my prayer to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Jesus, for your love and care. I'm thankful for you being in my life and all the good things you provide. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who need to hear this message. Please tell us about your experience and how you're getting ready for your own victorious homecoming in the comments below. Please think about giving to buy me a coffee if you want to help us out. This helps us consistently improve our content to provide you the best. In the description, you may find a link to buy me a coffee. There is no such thing as a modest gift. Your kindness, whether it's a penny, a prayer, or a share, helps spread God's message and gives people hope. Don't stop now. Watch our next video to learn more about the indicators that show you are the chosen one. We've enjoyed going on this spiritual trip with you. Thanks for sticking with us to the finish. Keep shining brightly and face your fate with bravery. See you later. From the awakened knowledge, blessings to all the wonderful individuals. Dear viewers, your support through Super Chat and membership is the only source of income that keeps this channel running. If you want me to continue uploading valuable content without delays and to stay motivated in providing you with the best wisdom, I need your help. Every contribution, big or small, makes a huge difference. Feel free to donate and support Pure Wisdom so we can keep growing together. Your generosity keeps this journey alive.